Hi, I'm Jeffrey Henning, Executive Director of the Market Research Institute International, and I'm looking forward to telling you a little bit about thinking that I've had about weighting online data and how my own practices have changed over time. So the reason I started to do this research is we have this document called the Market Research Core Body of Knowledge with the most practical things that we think every market researcher should know. And one of those has a learning objective about describe the challenges in obtaining representative samples and how those samples can be improved at the selection stage through weighting. And we update this periodically. We're just updating this for the fall, MRC BOK 2019. It's the 25th anniversary of it. And if you look back over time, the best practices for weighting have changed. And so I'm going to go through some of those practices. Typically, we would have said, don't weight on non-probability samples. Weighting is meant for probability samples. And I'm going to share some research with you about why you should consider weighting non-probability samples and the type of weighting to do. I want to give you a really simple example of weighting to start with. But the key thing is, I think most textbooks and most introductions to weighting present it as if it's just a process of arithmetic. And to show that process of arithmetic, here we have the United States population divided into 4 boxes, men versus women, 18 to 54, so adults versus 55 plus. So you take census data, you divide that up. And here we have a sample survey where we underrepresented the 55 and up. So we only had, 15 responses from men of that age, 17 responses from women. So you divide the total population that you know about by the number of respondents that you got, and that's the weight that you apply. Sometimes people will apply a weight so that they can extrapolate right from the survey to the target population, which is what was done in this case, so that each respondent equals 469,000 U.S. men. 18 to 54. And in this case, you can see that we really don't have enough 55 plus to be proportional. So too often it's shown as, okay, here's the math, you do the math and you're good. Well, there's lots of questions that are really more of an editorial process. And it turns out as you get into the academic literature, there aren't recommendations. There's just sort of best practices and things that people do. So, one of the things you'll hear about are caps and floors or weight trimming, where people don't like it if, so say we had only one person in that 55 plus segment, their weight would be disproportionate to the weights of the others. And so articles about people saying, well, we'll cap a weight at 5. So even if the weight should have been 10, we're going to say that all of the weights above 5 are set to 5. All of the weights below 0.2 are set to 0.2, but there's no research on that. There's just sort of practices that different organizations seem to have inherited from the past or from other projects that they've worked on. Some folks will tell you it should be 0.33 as a floor and 3. When you cap or floor a weight, you're making your sample less representative, but you're increasing the statistical power of your sample. So that's an editorial decision. The statistical power is as if it lowers the total number. So if you had said, so we'll take a simple example of 50 women and 1 man, that would almost act like a survey of 51 people instead of, if you weighted it, it would act that. So that's another issue, is which questions do you weight on? And I'm going to go through some of the more thinking on that, but that's also an editorial decision. And so it's a much more complicated process than the academic literature would lead you to believe. Cell weighting is what I gave an example of, where you're basically dividing the entire population up. And what has happened over time is people are like, well, we want to add more dimensions. We want to weight by age and gender and region. Okay, you can do that with census data and do cell weighting because the census will break it out. Depends on your national census, but they'll break it out. Well, we also want to weight by race, ethnicity, education level, household income, and a lot of organizations will have a proprietary measure. In the UK, it might be, which newspaper do you read? In different organizations, in the US, it might be your political party or your political leanings. you don't have enough data to create the matrix where you've broken down and said, okay, people in this cell, there's exactly this many of them. And so what rim weighting or raking does is it says, okay, well, let's wait till the outside data. So we know what percent of the overall population has these different educational levels. We'll weight towards that. So it would weight your data by age. And so at the end of that round, your data would accurately reflect age. Then it reruns it by sex, inheriting the weights from the prior round. Then it reruns it by region. So each time on that run, it's making it match for that last variable, but because it's using the weights from each step, it's permutating the weights, and it's getting closer and closer to being more representative across all of these without requiring data for each cell. And so that technique has been around for a long time, but computers have made this much easier to do. Most statistical products will do weighting, rim weighting like this, and so it's very easy to do. And so what's happened is people have done that and found that it is more representative than cell weighting, is to realize that you can add more dimensions. And don't worry about what this slide says. I just want to demonstrate how, for Pew research in particular, it evolved from a few metrics to far more. And here are what Pew used for non-probability samples. So they used interlocked variables as well as separate variables. So let me talk about both of those separately. First, they're using more variables to weight by. So they've added political party affiliation, political ideology. So in the US, how conservative or liberal are you? Slightly, somewhat, moderately. Voter registration. Are you a registered voter in your state or not? And then for US social policy research, evangelical Christianity. Are you a born again Christian or not? So those are added questions that they've done. But then they've also taken these, they've basically kind of reintroduced cells into rim weighting. So they've created a cell like the one I demonstrated for age by gender. But they've added cells for many permutations as they had data. So age by gender, age by race, ethnicity, age by education, and so forth. So by adding more interlocking, they're getting the best of both worlds, and their rim weighting process now goes through many more variables in each iteration. And what happens when you rim weight is over time, it converges closer and closer to running through this whole wheel. Just go back to the wheel for a sec. Running through the whole wheel, eventually it gets to the point where you really haven't changed the numbers, except maybe in the thousandth decimal point. You can stop, or some algorithms will just stop after 30 iterations. So we've done some tests with this. It is a challenge in the US to ask these questions. People don't want to necessarily answer them. We had a comment, you were all over the place. You were asking these questions on product services. Why were you going into political preferences that had nothing to do with the survey? Don't ask political questions. So people are used to ending a survey with demographics, age, gender, region, household income. They don't like it, but they're used to it. But this was for some a step too far. We then ran a version of the survey where we told people this data is just, so that we can weight it to be more representative of the overall population. Still, it's not something that people liked, and for B2B work, it might be something that you don't even want to ask. Instead, just go back and use the interlocked data and not these extra variables. So that was research that Pew did on non-probability panels. So they worked with 3 vendors, got non-probability data, and then they were weighting it and testing various weighting schemes, and that was the weighting scheme that they came up with that was most effective. They do actually also have a probability panel, which is a panel that they built by, in the US, randomly taking postal data, finding an address, randomly selecting addresses and inviting people to join the panel, inviting them multiple times, and offering them a tablet if they didn't have internet access to take surveys. And so for that, they use a slightly different weighting scheme because they had more control over how it was built. They added volunteerism and internet access, which for online surveys obviously wouldn't make sense, but they knew whether the person had internet access prior to joining or not. And the status of a region's size, because we're seeing differences by rural, suburban, urban. So again, different decisions based on different data sources, in that case by the same organization. Now, the key assumption behind weighting is that the folks that we didn't survey, who didn't take the survey, are like the folks we did survey for that dimension. And yet you can think of times where that's not true. And so it's not true for seniors. And it was one of the big reasons that if you asked me this question 10 years ago, I would have said, don't weight the data. Your seniors who did take the survey are internet using seniors, and they differ in health, outlook, openness to technology, and lots of ways from the seniors, from the other people their age who aren't using the internet. We also find that for immigrant communities, that the people who are taking the surveys are more likely to be acculturated than unacculturated, and so you can't necessarily extrapolate from their ethnicity and immigrant status to the whole group, because they're different from less acculturated peers. And even as we think that internet penetration is so high today that it has solved a lot of these problems, even in countries like the US that have been using the internet for a long time, you'll see that this isn't the case. So 9 out of 10 US adults are on the internet, and you can imagine that 1 out of 10 who aren't are very different than those 9 out of 10. And you can see that those who make less than 30,000, only 4 out of 5 of them are on the internet. And those who did not graduate high school are also less likely. Only 2 out of 3 of them are on the internet, similar levels to seniors, 65 and up. So you're extrapolating from folks who are taking your survey online, and I'm assuming most of this research is online since it's 99% of it, to folks who might be very different, even still today. So when people had been weighting convenience samples, they've been doing it for some good reasons. One, they believed that it didn't make things worse. They believed that it was improving the quality of the survey, and it mapped the demographic data from the survey to the demographic data of the U.S., or the target population, which removes a concern from users of the data that the data is not representative. And so those were all reasons that people would be weighting online data in the past. But now we've seen with Pew Research and others that so there had been early research on this in the hope it does no harm. And John Krosnick had found early on that, in fact, that wasn't true. So this is from a presentation I gave 5 years ago on my thoughts about weighting. And at that time, I was saying, demographically weighting non-probability samples was not producing more representative results. There were times it was actually producing less representative results, according to David Yeager and John Krosnick. John Krosnick is at Stanford. He's done a tremendous amount of research on research in the survey field. Now, what's changed since then is that Pew has seriously investigated using online surveys, non-probability surveys, for more of its work, and tested lots of different weighting methods and found that rim weighting did improve the quality of non-probability samples. Now, I should point out that they did all that testing, and then they decided to go to the expense of building a probability panel based on address-based sampling, giving people internet access. So it improves the results, not to the degree that they wanted for the social policy research that they do, but they did find that weighting non-probability samples improved it. Now, if I had presented this 5 years ago and you were a corporate user of research, I would say you probably don't need to weight your non-probability, your convenience sample data. But if you were a consultant, my message would have been slightly different, which was that it seemed like a lot of consulting firms were differentiating themselves based on what they weighted by. And so I think at the time, Polymetrics was weighting by newspaper readership in the UK. Harris was weighting by some different online likelihood to be online, and so people had built their proprietary methods that weren't academically validated, but that they felt were improving the results. And so it was a differentiator to come up with a weighting scheme that was sort of unique to your organization. The propensity weighting was one of the Harris techniques, and weighting by attitudinally was something that we'd seen different people doing to try to correct for problems with non-convenient samples. But really, what's changed all that, as I've alluded to, is this Pew study, and so I do encourage you to read this. This extensive report is available for free for weighting online opt-in samples. What matters most, and they found that it's interesting. They consider rim weighting or raking to be a very simple technique. They were doing propensity scoring, some sample matching. They were doing other more complex techniques as well. And they found that those barely moved the needle. And the best way to improve the representativeness of a non-probability survey was to use rim weighting the way that I showed. They did find that estimates depended on some of the demographics, the improvement that you would see. So the gray is the unweighted data. So this is the average absolute difference between the population benchmarks and the sample estimates. So they tested raking, and then they tested the sample matching and propensity plus raking, and found that in most cases, the more complex statistical method, was not improving things beyond raking, which is rim weighting. So their recommendation was to use rim weighting going forward. And that's going to be what our recommendation is to folks. Now, wait is this is a great quote from my predecessor at the MRII and current SMR ambassador, Reg Baker, which is that waiting until the waiting stage to adjust is too late. And not knowing who ended up in your non-probability sample or why, can lead to trying to extrapolate from people to, as we said with seniors and acculturated versus unacculturated minorities, can lead to bigger differences. And so it's important to try to build your sample so that weighting is less needed. And so basically that would involve quota sampling. And quota sampling still is traditionally done on a cell basis. And here's a simple quota sample using our prior example. And this is if we had wanted the weights to be as minimal as possible, how many people would we have needed in each? And so this survey, as I referenced, underrepresented 55 and up. So you would have needed 61 men and 72 women. And so by designing a quota scheme like that, now the effective weights on age and gender is much lower. And you've gotten a more representative sample. Different quota schemes that we've seen, some of this was from the Pew paper, and some of the other work is you'll see, so what I showed was sex by age. You'll see sex by age by region. You might see overlapping designs, which then become a little trickier. And I think we'll tweet out Ray Pointer's great article about some of the challenges when you have interlocking, when you have overlaying quota designs. So sex by age and then region independently. And then you can see some folks who are really almost doing rim quotas, which always make me nervous because then you're left to try to find, a left-handed 75-year-old in North Carolina. So it makes it tough to sort of get those last ones. People will often say soft quotas, which I've never quite understood what a soft quota is. I guess it's just a quota with bigger error margins in terms of not filling each box, but trying to fill each box. So quota schemes are also evolving to be more complex to make sure that the survey is more representative. And I think that it's important when you think about weighting that you think about the quota design as well. So our recommendations are, if you have a non-probability sample and it's a true convenience sample, you weren't able to exercise any control over who took the survey, there's no quota sampling, then don't weight the results. You're not going to improve the quality. But if you did have some control over who took the survey, you know, and you were using quota sampling, then weight to correct, then definitely apply the weighting. Also, if there's oversamples, so there's times where you might be oversampling by region. In the UK, you might want to oversample South Wales, you might want to oversample the north of England, so that you can draw better comparisons, even those have less population. Well, then weighting will fix those oversamples when you're reporting the top line number. A lot of times when fielding a survey, you can provide dashboards during the survey fielding, but if you're using quota sampling, early results are going to be skewed as quota cells fill, and so using your weighting scheme as a preliminary interim reporting to kind of correct for that. Different software that you look at has different strengths and weaknesses, and some don't weight crosstabs. So just keep that in mind, that you might have weighted all the top line data, but when you're looking at the crosstab data, that it is unweighted. Some other items that we've discovered as we've worked with this, it's often better to, a lot of times in a survey, you will screen out the people and you will not include them in your data set if they weren't using the category of interest. You really want to include those in the results, because it's better to weight on the screener than on the people who just took the data. Otherwise, you're making the survey, you're making the results much less representative. And that does mean that your screener is going to need to contain some weighting variables that maybe you weren't screening them on the geographic region they lived in for that study, but you're going to want that for weighting. So the screener becomes a little longer as you capture some of the demographic information you're going to use to weight. If you can't include the disqualified respondents for different reasons in terms of how you're fielding the survey, or you have a survey now that you need to weight where you didn't do that, one of the things that you can do is to run an omnibus question. So organizations, research firms will run 1, 2, or 3 questions for you, which you can use to estimate the population totals. So those will go from a GenPop sample. And it really is important that you kind of understand your benchmarks that you're weighting on, because if you've ever inherited a survey that you had to weight, you might see that, well, the way they ask education, doesn't match the census data. So maybe I can map it to match the census data, or maybe I have to make some assumptions. So it's good to have the data that you're going to weight to upfront, so that you design your questions around that. So those are some gotchas that we've seen. As we've dove into this research, it's been a surprise to me, the things that we don't know. As I said, the caps and floors when you're trimming weighting, the trade-offs on sample balance, if you've weighted by many items, and therefore the effective sample balance has lowered. The Pew Research was on very large sample size studies, which is not typical of what many of us are fielding. So there's still a lot of items to weight. But whereas 5 years ago, I would have told you, don't weight your non-probability sample. Now I'm telling you that I think that the research is showing that we should weight it. And we have to make do with some best practices while we learn and conduct more research on research to learn really the right ways to do some of these other items. For more reading, I really encourage you to check out that Pew report, which came out, I think, in January of this year. It really was eye-opening for me, changed my thinking on a lot of these issues. For the hard practical nuts of how do you do this in R or SPSS or display R, check out the display R white paper, How to Weight Survey Data, which gives you a lot of the pragmatic details of applying these techniques in statistical software of your choice. Happy to have you reach out to me through LinkedIn, email, or Twitter to discuss any of these questions in more detail. But we will take some questions right now.
Thank you, Jeffrey. And we've got 2 questions in already, but there will be time. So if you want to type in your question, that's great. So the first question, I'm going to add a little bit to their question. They've said, should we always quote the effective sample size? And perhaps you could also just tell people what the effective sample size is, Jeffrey.
Yeah, so the effective sample size, so I think I oversimplified it as I talked about it. So typically you'll say, so like I was trying to say, if you surveyed, 50 men and 1 woman, well, actually the effective sample size I think would be close to 2 because you have to reduce the value of the men there. But in fact, just to make it even more complicated, the effective sample size varies based on the analytical technique you run. So it's not just, I think a lot of times we'll oversimplify it and say, well, this survey has an effective sample size of 660 out of 1,000. That's something that I've seen done. That kind of refers to maybe the statistical technique that's used the most. And so I do see organization, I think it's important to talk about the fact that for an organization that wants to think about error margin, what's the margin of error, you really aren't supposed to calculate it for a non-probability sample, but I know that we get asked, or there's an assumption that we can use the margin of error. And so, I encourage folks to look at some sort of credibility interval calculation that uses that, and that has to be based on a sort of average effective sample size for the whole study. So I do think it is important to talk about, even though I've probably not always talked about it in the past, but at least I think put it in a footnote, that because of weighting, you've reduced the statistical power of the overall sample. Is that fair, Ray?
I think that's very fair. And certainly I would always state what the reduced is. And quite often when people see a number like they've paid for 1,000 interviews and now it says the effective sample size is 660, their faces go a little white. You say, well, maybe we'll weight it a bit less. So fantastic question coming up next, which bridges 2 presentations, which is part of what makes it fantastic. So thinking of Karen's presentation, do you know if anybody has tried weighting by one or all of the Jonathan Hyde et al.'s moral foundation scores? So weighting by things like care, harm, fairness, group loyalty, authority, respect, those sorts of characteristics. So emotional drivers as opposed to very tangible things like how many years of high school did you have?
Yeah, so my old advice, was if you're a client, if you're a client-side researcher, don't weight non-probability samples, and if you're a supplier, invest in coming up with a unique proprietary way of weighting them as a differentiator. And I think the things that people were looking at was broadening beyond traditional demographic data to attitudinal data. I think that's certainly what Polymetrics and YouGov did. And internet propensity from Harris. So I think I have not seen anyone weight on those, but I would think it would be an interesting exercise to do. So I would encourage folks to perhaps to see if that improves. Certainly, you've seen in the U.S. Pew add political ideology and evangelical Christianity because of a concern about different response rates from those groups, and that's one of the reasons that they've started to put that into more of their social policy research, which they certainly wouldn't have in the past.
So we've got some more questions coming in here. And again, I'm going to adapt one of these questions. So the first one is talking about seniors and the hubris of youth. Every over 60, 65 is identical. One of the issues with the cell that you showed is you weighted the 55 plus, and people like Dave McCorkin have shown that in the mind of the client, that might have an average age of 75. But if you look at the data, it's heaped, and most of that data is only 58, 59, 62 years old. So when we weight it, we're not necessarily doing what we think we are because we've used these broad buckets of age grouping.
I agree. I think that's one of the reasons why early on my advice was not to wait, because we would see that exact sort of heaping. And just a general concern that the groups you were weighting by in cell weighting weren't actually, representative. Again, with minority populations, you see that the acculturated members of that population are more likely to take your survey than the unacculturated ones. But you're extrapolating from the acculturated ones to represent the entire group. I think that's one of the reasons that the move has been. I think that's one of several reasons why people have moved towards rim weighting instead, because you're getting away from assigning everyone into a unique box, and you're trying to treat each individual multidimensionally.
So quite a long question here, so I'll try to go through it carefully. Do strongly correlated variables overweight similar variables? So including political party affiliation and political ideology end up overdoing that? And wouldn't it be better to have fewer variables that you're weighting by and probably uncorrelated variables?
So, yeah, I mean, I think the examples that Pew uses in their weighting, if you look at political party, that's correlated to political ideology, and evangelical Christianity, which they include, typically, correlates to conservatives and Republicans. So those are all, correlated, and yet, if there's an organization I trust for social policy research, it's Pew, and so I think that they've. If you've looked at how their studies have evolved over the years in terms of them adding more weighting, while they haven't, they're pretty transparent, but they haven't published everything that they've done in terms of relation to this. So, so I haven't independently validated it, but they seem to believe that adding more of those dimensions improves the quality of it. It does lead to extreme weighting, and if you pull down a YouGov study that they've published, you'll see, often very extreme weight values where they're not capping and trimming. So you might see a respondent who's worth, 1/100th of the lowest weighted respondent might be worth 1/100th of the highest weighted respondent in a study like that, which is why I tried to dive more into the caps and floors for weights, and that academic literature was just unfortunately a dead end. But I understand your concerns, and yet Pew has seemed to have developed a methodology that kind of flies in the face of that, counterintuitive as it seems.
And as a basic way of doing research, does it make sense to always use quota samples for age and gender for studies with samples of less than 2,000, do you think?
I typically recommend people use at least age, gender, and region. It really depends on the study. I mean, one of the things you look at is, I guess a better way to think of quota samples are what groups are you underrepresenting? And on online surveys, you're typically underrepresenting people who did not complete any education. So in the US, they did not complete high school. Those folks are definitely not taking online surveys at anywhere near the same rate. So I've seen surveys where you've quota sampled on education, Hispanicity, as well as age, gender, and region. Basically, the goal of quota sampling is to try to get your weights to be less extreme, right? So if you're studying something where those dimensions don't, if you've done other work in the area and you've seen, education status doesn't affect, chewing gum usage or whatever you're studying, then it's not a concern. But if it does affect that, then you should, I think, try to take that into account during the quota sample. So
that brings us to the final question, which relates to the point you've just been made. So from a weighting study, you'll see who you under-collected on that study. And linking back to Reg's point about weight, would it make sense to recruit those people first on the next study, as opposed to simply sending out invitations and then trying to make up the missing cells?
Yeah, actually, one of the things that we've done in some of these efforts is fill the hard to fill cells, or fill them as close as you can. The gen pop characteristics, the cells that normally would fill the fastest, and I'll tweet out we did an analysis of sort of which cells fill up the first for an age, gender, region study, which I'll tweet out. But definitely, I think you try to fill the hard cells first, because the other cells are pretty easy to fill and can fill rapidly.
Great, thank you so much, Jeffrey. And I'm, as chair of the session, going to be self-indulgent. I was snowboarding last week, and I had a lesson, and I had this presentation in my mind. And near the end, the instructor said, "Right, this section's really flat, so weighting is going to be more important." And I looked at him with my pedantic sense, and then I said, "I'm going to have to ask you, how did you spell that when you said weighting?" And he said W-E-I-G-H-T. I thought, great, because I want to know whether we had to wait longer for the snowboard to turn. The other two people in my class threw their hands up and said, "Oh my God, I've been hearing it wrongly all week." And he has been saying it that way for 5 years, evidently. So yes, weighting can be quite an interesting topic.
That's fun.
So thank you so much, Jeffrey. Always good to talk to you. Will I see you in Edinburgh next week?
You will. You will.
Excellent. So if anybody's got any more weighting questions, when you download the slides, you'll be able to look at some more of those answers. But there's also Jeffrey's contact details. The MRII at the University of Georgia have got a fantastic range of resources. So please keep that in mind.